Most people imagine the so-called Dark Ages as a distant blur of castles, knights, and flickering torches, a vague era where hardship existed, but where daily life somehow moved along in a simple rhythm beneath the protection of walls and lords. Yet the hidden truth that emerges when we examine England around the year 900 is far more unsettling. Because survival was never guaranteed, and comfort was rarely part of the equation. And if you had been born into that world, your first realization would come not from a dramatic battle or royal decree, but from the quiet, relentless pressure of ordinary life pressing against the body from the moment you opened your eyes each morning. You would wake before dawn, not because discipline demanded it, but because the structure of the day required every available hour of light. And inside your small dwelling, the air would carry the lingering bite of smoke from a hearth that never truly cleared, drifting low beneath the rough thatch roof and settling in the throat with a dryness that made each breath feel heavier than it should. The ground beneath your feet would be compacted earth, worn smooth by generations of movement, hardened in places where spilled grain or animal droppings had been pressed down over years until the surface carried the faint texture of daily survival itself. Your home would not separate human life from animal life in the way modern houses do, because pigs, chickens, and sometimes a small goat might share the same single room, shifting in the dim light and breathing warmth into the air, their presence tolerated not out of affection but necessity, since their heat helped fight the cold and their survival meant food, trade, or protection against hunger later in the year. Privacy would not exist in the way modern people understand it. Families slept close together on straw mattresses or rough bedding stuffed with whatever materials could be gathered from the surrounding fields. Conversations, breathing, coughing, the restless movement of animals, all of it blended into a constant background noise that never fully disappeared, reminding you that life in this period unfolded in shared spaces where individual comfort was secondary to collective endurance. Food, when it appeared, arrived not as a choice, but as a calculation. The bread you ate would likely be coarse and dark, made from barley or rye ground on stone mills that left small particles of grit inside the flour, and each bite would carry a dense, sour taste that lingered on the tongue, not because anyone aimed to create flavor, but because this was the grain that could survive in the soil and climate available to the village. You would chew slowly, feeling the firmness of the crust and the heaviness of the grain settling into the stomach, aware that the body required energy long before the work had even begun. Water drawn from nearby streams or shallow wells might taste fresh in the moment, yet it carried unseen risks that no one could properly explain, because germ theory lay centuries in the future, and sickness appeared to move through communities like a mystery rather than a mechanism. Sometimes people drank and felt nothing. Sometimes they drank and fell ill within days. The pattern existed, but the cause remained invisible. And here, before any work in the fields began, one of the most important truths of this world revealed itself quietly but firmly. Survival depended less on personal ambition than on the system you were born into. In early medieval England, around the year 900, that system was rigid enough to shape nearly every decision a person could make before they were old enough to understand what a decision even was. And if you had been born into a peasant household, the path before you would already be laid out with a quiet certainty that left little room for imagination. Most people living in England during this period belonged to the broad and heavy foundation of society known as the peasantry. And within that group, a large portion were what historians call serfs, individuals bound not to a single master in the sense of slavery, but to the land itself, a legal arrangement that might sound abstract at first until you felt how it functioned in practice. Being tied to the land meant that the fields you worked were not chosen by preference or opportunity. They were inherited obligations, and with them came a network of duties that moved upward through the social order like grain through a mill. You labored in strips of land scattered across the open fields surrounding the village, each strip narrow and long so that the soil could be divided among many families. And while some of that harvest belonged to your household, a significant portion flowed upward to the local lord who controlled the estate. This was the quiet engine of the early medieval economy. Labor moved upward, protection and authority flowed downward. The arrangement was presented as mutual necessity, but its balance always leaned toward those at the top. The physical reality of that labor began as soon as the morning meal ended. Tools were simple and heavy, crafted from wood reinforced with iron where resources allowed. The plow itself demanded coordination, guiding an ox or team of animals through thick soil that resisted every pass. Each furrow carved through the earth carried a weight that traveled through the arms and into the shoulders, and after hours of repeating the same motion, the body learned a kind of endurance that was not dramatic but deeply ingrained, the muscles adjusting slowly to the rhythm of work that had little regard for comfort. Farming in this period was not merely planting and harvesting, it was an ongoing negotiation with the land. Rain could soften the soil into workable ground or drown seedlings before they had the chance to root. Frost could arrive too early, turning an entire season of effort into a memory of what might have been. Pests, wandering livestock, or simple miscalculation could thin the harvest long before it reached the storage barns. Each of these uncertainties carried consequences that rippled through the winter months ahead. When historians describe medieval survival, they often focus on dramatic events, such as famine or invasion. But the more constant pressure came from these smaller variables that shaped daily life without ceremony. The village community itself functioned as both support and constraint within this system. People relied on one another for tasks that required more than a single household could provide, such as building structures, repairing tools, or bringing in the harvest before weather changed. Yet the same closeness that allowed cooperation also meant that resources were visible to everyone. When one family struggled, the entire village felt the tension of scarcity spreading quietly through shared expectations. If grain stores ran low, adjustments had to be made collectively, stretching rations, mixing barley with oats, or thinning stews so that the same pot could serve more mouths. As the seasons turned and the rhythm of agricultural life pressed forward, survival in England's early medieval villages revealed itself not as a single struggle, but as a chain of pressures that tightened slowly over the year, each stage demanding a different form of endurance from the body and mind. The work in the fields did not end when the sun dipped toward the horizon, because the land demanded constant attention long after daylight faded. Tools had to be repaired, animals fed, grain sorted, and firewood gathered before darkness settled completely over the village. Even the act of resting was conditional, shaped by the knowledge that the following morning would return with the same demands waiting patiently beyond the door. When autumn arrived, the entire community moved with a quiet urgency, because the harvest season represented a narrow window during which the success or failure of the entire year would become clear. Fields that had been plowed, seeded and weeded through months of effort now had to be cut quickly before storms or frost could ruin what remained. Men and women moved through the crops with sickles, their hands repeating the same curved motion hour after hour, the metal blades slicing through stalks while the scent of crushed grain filled the air with a dry sweetness that mixed with sweat and dust. The physical strain built gradually in the arms and back, yet the work continued because every bundle of grain represented food stored against the uncertainty of winter. Harvest time was not festive in the way later stories sometimes suggest. It was intense, exhausting, and filled with quiet calculations about how much had been saved and how much might still be lost. Once the crops were gathered, the grain had to be threshed, separating edible kernels from the surrounding husks through repeated beating or trampling that filled barns with floating particles of chaff. Breathing inside those spaces could feel heavy and irritating, tiny fragments catching in the throat and lungs. Yet the work continued because unfinished grain offered no protection against hunger. When winter finally arrived, it brought a different kind of pressure. The fields fell silent beneath frost, but the labor of survival simply shifted indoors. Food stores were measured carefully, each sack of grain representing weeks of careful consumption. Meals became smaller and simpler as the cold months stretched on, with pottage made from dried peas, barley, onions, or whatever preserved foods remained from autumn. Firewood became as important as bread because warmth determined whether the household could endure long nights without illness. Gathering fuel in advance was essential, and families who misjudged their supply sometimes faced bitter evenings wrapped in blankets beside fading embers, listening to the wind push against the walls of their homes. Throughout these cycles, disease remained an unpredictable companion. Without medical knowledge capable of explaining infection or contamination, illness moved through communities in ways that felt mysterious and often frightening. A cough might pass quietly after a few days, or it might deepen into something that weakened the body for weeks. Fevers could appear suddenly and vanish just as quickly, leaving behind exhaustion that made even simple tasks difficult. Yet the system of village life rarely paused for individual weakness. Fields still required tending, animals still needed feeding, and grain still had to be ground into flour. In this sense, survival in the early medieval world depended less on personal resilience than on participation in the collective routines that held the community together. The structure of daily labor continued regardless of who felt strong or weak on any particular day, because the village itself functioned like a living mechanism where each task supported the next.